All right, let's dive right into this explainer and explore a fascinating, if pretty brutal, chapter of history we're calling the Bargain of Light. To really wrap our heads around the sheer scale of the Cetacean Empire, we need to set the scene. Picture yourself in 18th century New England. You're inside a wooden home. A vicious nor'easter is howling outside, and the harbor is completely choked by solid pack ice. It's freezing, the timbers are creaking, and the whole world just feels incredibly bleak.
And outside, it is total suffocating blackness. The only thing fighting back that absolute dark is a single harsh point of amber flame, a small whale oil lamp just sputtering against a freezing window pane. You have to imagine a world where darkness wasn't merely an inconvenience, but a literal physical threat. Before our modern grid of convenience, before electricity and gas, nightfall meant absolute impenetrable blindness. In those bone-freezing coastal winters, survival itself depended entirely on fire, and fire depended on fuel.
Section 1. The Threat of Darkness.
To see, to work, and to just keep the heavy machinery of the early Industrial Revolution actually turning, society desperately needed a very specific kind of grease, and that vital grease came from this, the sperm whale, the largest toothed predator on Earth. This massive, highly intelligent animal became the absolute most valuable target in the American deep-sea fishery. The men out there on the water weren't just fishing. They were literally hunting leviathans.
There's a phrase that perfectly captures this. The whale's death became the price of everyday life. And that's exactly how the dominant commercial culture treated these animals, simply as a necessary source of light, labor, and wealth. It formed this incredibly grim but entirely accepted bargain for survival. People genuinely believed that without this oil, homes would go dark and manufacturing would just grind to a halt.
Section 2. The Cetacean Empire.
Now, you might think of coastal spots like Nantucket and New Bedford as sleepy little fishing villages, right? But no, they were the towering financial engines of this entire empire. And geography practically forced their hand. Because of the poor soil and limited agriculture on the islands, they were economically constrained by the land. So they had to look outward to the violent ocean for survival. Whale products became their absolute most critical lighting and industrial commodities. Now, to be historically accurate, sure, other fuels and materials existed at the time, but none were as incredibly effective or as heavily commercialized as what they pulled up from the deep sea.
Section 3. Anatomy of a Prize. So why this specific animal? To understand that, we have to look at the biological engine itself. Ordinary whale oil, which they rendered from the blubber, did the heavy lifting for society. It fueled the street lamps and greased the early factory machinery. But the ultimate prize, that was spermaceti. This was a biological reservoir of waxy liquid found exclusively inside the sperm whale's massive rectangular head. It was prized above all else because it burned brighter, cleaner, and way longer than any other oil known to humanity at the time. And beyond just the oil, the rest of the animal was aggressively commodified. Take baleen, for example. It basically became the structural foundation of the Victorian era. We are talking about the stiffening in corsets, the flexibility in buggy whips, even the ribs holding up your umbrella against the rain. It was essentially the highly versatile plastic of its day.
Section 4. The Capitalist Machine.
Of course, this wasn't just some rugged maritime adventure. It was a highly organized capitalist machine that bankrolled incredibly dangerous multi-year voyages, and it operated on a strict investment framework known as the lay system. Basically, instead of getting a guaranteed fixed wage for their dangerous labor, sailors were paid a percentage share of the profits, but only after the voyage's cargo was brought back and sold. It tied their very survival and their pay directly to the success of the harvest.
But let's look at how that actually played out in reality. Ship owners, who were sitting safely on land, commonly extracted 60 to 70% of the total profits. That left maybe 35% to be divided among the entire crew of laborers out there doing the actual perilous, life-threatening work. So, as we can see, the massive financial rewards of this incredibly lucrative industry, yeah, they were definitely not shared equally.
Section 5. The Human Cost. Because of that glaring financial disparity, we really need to look past the abstract machinery and humanize the diverse individuals actually out there risking their lives in the freezing dark. This labor force was profoundly international. Ships leaving New Bedford would stop for provisions along their routes and literally recruit globally. Azorian sailors joined the crews in droves, and Cape Verdean sailors became absolutely vital laborers in the New Bedford whaling system. And wonderfully, a lot of these same sailors later settled down in southeastern Massachusetts, forever shaping the rich culture of that region today.
So we're left with this lingering thought.
Everyone at the time agreed that these whale products were vital for human progress. But at what terrifying price to the men sent out to harvest them? The whale's death paid for the literal light of everyday life, for sure. But as we look back on this history, we're forced to ask who truly absorbed the terrifying human cost of this bargain? Was it just the leviathans of the deep, or was it also the men shivering in the dark fueling an empire that mostly enriched those safe on the shore?
The danger of whaling was absolutely not limited to just the moment of the kill. Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to dive straight into the incredibly harsh reality of mid-19th century American whaling. Now, history often paints the whaleman as this swashbuckling, romantic adventurer sailing off into the sunset. But today, we're going to completely shatter that myth. We're going to look at actual historical records, ship logs, and first-hand accounts to reveal the true, brutal, sensory nightmare of a whale ship. We are stepping aboard the floating slaughterhouse, where the stench, the hunt, and the try works to find a truly grueling existence. So there is a very stark contrast between the myth and the unvarnished reality of the mid-19th century whaleman. We've all seen the myth, right? Well-fed men heroically leaving behind the brick-paved mansions of places like Nantucket to go conquer the high seas. But then, there's the reality. A whale ship of this era was absolutely not a cruise vessel. It was a miserable, reeking prison. Once these square-rigged ships hit the rolling seas, they effectively became floating industrial factories. Their sole driving purpose was to harvest, slaughter, and process massive animals, which left the decks permanently caked in grease, black soot, and dried blood. You see, the danger of mid-19th century whaling wasn't just that adrenaline-fueled moment of fighting a whale. The true test of endurance was the everyday, relentless deprivation. The entire voyage was practically structured around sheer misery. We're talking about years, literally years away from your family, subsisting on incredibly poor food, living in unimaginably cramped quarters, battling disease, and facing deadly discipline from captains, all while knowing that just one single mistake out on the water could kill you. Now, check out this number, 40 to 46. By the mid-19th century, whaling voyages didn't just last for a few weeks or a couple of months. For many large ships undertaking deep-sea Pacific voyages, the time spent away from home frequently stretched an agonizing 40 to 46 months. Just imagine that. That is nearly 4 years of your life trapped on a rolling, salt-blistered wooden deck in the middle of the ocean. All right, let's move below deck. Section 1, Life in the Forecastle in 1858. So the ordinary crew lived packed into what was called the forecastle. Think of it as a cramped, unventilated, subterranean hole right in the bow of the ship. We actually have a very visceral account from a sealer named William Abbey, written after just one night in the forecastle of the ship Atkins Adams in 1858. He describes it as filthy in the extreme. He talks about sick men vomiting on the floor, the vomit running down between chests, mixing with old bits of meat, onion skins, spilled coffee, and chewing tobacco spit to form a disgusting compound. It's incredibly difficult to stomach, I know, but hearing that is absolutely essential to understanding their reality back then. And listen, if their living space was a nightmare, their diet was honestly no better. Over the course of those 40-plus months, rations quickly degenerated to rotting salt beef and maggoty hardtack. Plus, they were never truly alone down there. Rats, lice, and bedbugs were the mid-19th century sailors' inescapable, constant companions in the dark of that forecastle. Now, you might be wondering, well, they're surrounded by whales. Why not just eat them? And it's a fair question. But while mid-19th century American whalers did sometimes eat portions of fresh whale when their normal food supplies were severely running out, it was absolutely not accepted as ordinary shipboard food. And it was definitely not the central economic reason for the hunt during this era. They were not out there for meat, they were out there for oil. Which brings us to Section 2, the pervasive stench of the mid-19th century. One sailor in 1860 described the ship as if the ill odors of the entire world were gathered together and shaken up. But Charles Nordhoff, who actually sailed as a young man, left us this incredibly brutal sensory record. He wrote, "Everything is drenched with oil. The loathsome stuff literally dripped from their shirts and trousers. Even worse, he noted that the very pores of their skin, their feet, their hands, their hair, all of it seemed to be physically filled with the grease of the whale." Nordhoff goes on to explain how this pervasive filth infected absolutely everything, including their meager rations. He wrote that the biscuits you ate actually glistened with oil. Imagine that. Every single bite tasted as though it had just been pulled straight out of the blubber room. There was just no escaping it. They were literally consuming the atmosphere of this floating slaughterhouse. Okay, let's look at how this all actually happened. Section 3, the hunt and the kill in the mid-19th century. The mid-19th century whale hunt was an adrenaline-fueled sequence of absolute life-or-death precision. First, the lookout cries out from the masthead. That famous line, "Thar she blows." Instantly, small, super-fragile whaleboats are dropped into the open sea. The men row furiously toward a wild animal that outweighs them 100 to 1. Then comes the critical moment. A harpoon is thrown, completely fastening their tiny wooden boat directly to the massive whale. What happened next bore a deceptively fun-sounding name, the Nantucket Sleigh Ride. But make no mistake, this mid-19th century practice was absolutely terrifying. Once harpooned, the injured whale would immediately flee, towing the small boat rapidly through the open water, sometimes dragging them for miles at a time. The crew had to frantically struggle just to control the screaming rope line, knowing full well that a single tangle could capsize the boat and drown them all in an instant. Eventually, the massive animal exhausts itself. The crew carefully approaches the tired whale, and a boat header thrusts a long lance deep into the whale's lungs or heart. After the strike, the crew has to quickly back away and wait through the animal's death throes. Finally, once dead, the enormous 50-ton carcass is secured and painstakingly towed all the way back to the main ship. That waiting period I just mentioned, that's known as the flurry, the bloody and incredibly violent death agony of the harpooned whale. In the mid-19th century, this was a chaotic, thrashing struggle that literally churned the ocean red. You have to remember, even a dying whale could effortlessly smash a whaleboat to splinters with a single strike of its tail. It was incredibly dangerous. Transitioning to the aftermath now. Section 4, blood and the try-works in the mid-19th century. So, the 50-ton carcass is now changed to the rolling hull of the ship. This initiates a process called cutting in. Men had to balance on a highly dangerous, slippery cutting stage suspended right over the water, using massive spades to peel off ton-weight blanket pieces of blubber. Meanwhile, sharks and other scavenging animals would rapidly gather around the bleeding carcass, swimming mere inches from the men's boots. This added immense danger and frantic urgency to what was already completely exhausting work. Once that blubber was hauled aboard, the ship transformed entirely into its namesake, a floating factory. The blubber was chopped into pieces and thrown into the try-works. What are the try-works? They were these massive iron pots set directly into a brick furnace, right there on the wooden deck of these mid-19th century ships. They were used to render down the boiling blubber. And here's the craziest part. To keep the fires burning day and night, they literally used the scraps of the whale to fuel the fire that melted its own fat. Let's go back to Charles Nordhoff for a second to truly understand the atmosphere on deck during this process. He described a fetid smoke from those scrap fires that you were compelled to breathe until it felt like filth had struck right into your blood. He said, "From this smell and taste of blubber, raw, boiling, and burning, there is no relief or place of refuge." It was so bad that the captains themselves referred to the ship during this time as a little hell on earth. Which brings us to a critical, lasting thought to end our explainer today. When you strip away all that swashbuckling romance and look at the brutal facts, the filthy forecastle, the rotting food, the terrifying hunts, and the suffocating try-works, you really have to ask yourself a question. If survival meant living inside a floating slaughterhouse for up to 46 months at a time, at what point did the industrial cost of oil outweigh the cost of human endurance? It's a gritty, really uncomfortable question, but honestly, it's the only way to truly understand the heavy, heavy toll of mid-19th century American whaling.
Welcome to The Explainer. We're looking at a pretty profound piece of history today. And honestly, it features a massive plot twist that completely rewrites how most of us understand environmental conservation. We're talking about the era of global whaling, a time when the oceans were pushed to the absolute brink. For centuries, the world was quite literally lit by the biology of these marine leviathans. I mean, the very gears of the early Industrial Revolution, they were greased by whale oil. But here's the hook. The whales were not saved by some sudden miraculous wave of human morality. As you'll see, they were actually saved by chemistry, technology, and, well, cold hard economics. The story of how humanity finally stopped hunting the world's largest mammals is, for sure, one of the most fascinating economic mysteries of the past 3 centuries.
Okay, let's dive into this roadmap for today.
We're going to start by unpacking the myth of morality, then look at the economics of depletion and labor flight, hit a massive petroleum plot twist in the 1850s, explore a really strange technology paradox, and finally, track the shift from treating whales as a resource to a full-blown rescue operation. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. The Myth of Morality, spanning 1760 to 1869.
To really understand how this era ended, we've got to look at the terrifying, almost chaotic scale of destruction during the height of the Nantucket whaling era. Picture a world completely dependent on the oil from these creatures for its most basic industrial needs. Everything from the lamps that lit the cobblestone streets of London and Boston to the lubricants that literally kept early steam engines from seizing up. Which leads us to a really fascinating question. Did a sudden moral awakening save the whales? It's incredibly tempting to look back at history and imagine that one day society simply woke up, looked at the brutal reality of the whaling industry, and collectively decided, this is wrong. But actually, history's rarely that noble on a mass scale.
Just think about the sheer math of the slaughter for a second. Between 1760 and 1869, documented voyages from Nantucket alone returned about 1.1 million barrels of sperm oil. Now, when you apply a scholarly average of roughly 34 barrels of oil per sperm whale, well, that represents more than 32,000 sperm whales destroyed by a single port. And remember, that's just from documented Nantucket voyages. Globally, hundreds of thousands of sperm, right, bowhead, and humpback whales were being relentlessly hunted. We're talking about massive fleets of wooden ships sailing to the absolute ends of the earth, with men plunging harpoons by hand, all just to keep reading lamps burning back home. The oceans were quite literally becoming silent.
So if morality didn't stop this incredible slaughter, what did? Well, it was a massive, highly specific stack of historical variables. Society didn't magically change its mind out of nowhere. Instead, a series of very distinct forces, depletion, labor competition, petroleum, the technology paradox, science, activism, and law, they all collided at exactly the right time to completely shatter the industry's economic foundations. We're going to break these down step by step because this perfectly demonstrates how the world actually changes.
Section 2. Depletion and Labor Flight, from 1760 to 1849.
Before any alternative fuels were even invented, the whaling industry actually began strangling itself from the inside. It was essentially an industry choking on its own success. This is the fundamental law of scarcity at work. As whales were heavily exploited, the accessible populations right near coastal waters naturally vanished. So, to fill a ship with oil, you couldn't just sail off the coast for a few months anymore. Successful voyages now required charting waters much, much further away, which obviously demanded greater capital and significantly greater risk. Imagine being packed onto a wooden ship for 5 grueling years, battling scurvy, deep isolation, violent storms, just to return with a fraction of the oil you used to get in half the time. The cost to outfit these massive expeditions skyrocketed, literally stretching the economic viability of whaling to its absolute breaking point.
And then, the labor market reacted. And honestly, this is where history gets a bit absurd. Imagine being a hardened whaleman. You're facing that brutal 5-year expedition, and suddenly you hear a rumor that there's free gold just sitting in the dirt out in California. Well, between October 1848 and December 1849, more than 650 Nantucketers simply walked away from the whaling trade. Hundreds of ships were left literally rotting in San Francisco Bay because crews essentially dropped their harpoons, hopped off the boat, and vanished into the hills to prospect for gold. Labor walked away entirely, migrating instantly toward a vastly better economic prospect.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is this historical observation that perfectly captures this rapid shift in the labor force. Quote, California did not persuade sailors that whales had become morally wrong. It gave them another way to live. That right there is the crux of our entire story. Human behavior shifted at a massive scale, not because the ethical consensus changed, but because the economic incentives shifted right beneath their feet.
Section 3. The Petroleum Plot Twist, taking us from the 1850s to 1859.
By the 1850s, the whaling industry was severely wobbling from scarcity and those massive labor shortages, but it was still technically necessary for lighting the world. And then came the ultimate substitute. First, Abraham Gesner developed kerosene refining during the 1850s, which created a synthetic alternative. Then, in 1859, Edwin Drake struck oil with his famous Pennsylvania well. Guys, this was an absolute economic earthquake. Overnight, an entirely new industry sprang from the dirt. Instead of chasing leviathans across the globe for years at a time, you could just pump a superior fuel straight out of the ground. It accelerated the commercial expansion of petroleum in a massive way, absolutely flooding the market with cheap, clean-burning fuel.
So the crucial point is, petroleum created a cheaper, infinitely more scalable competitor for the global lighting market. This is where the true death of necessity really begins. By providing an alternative that was vastly more efficient, the core economic reason to hunt whales was fundamentally weakened. Once society didn't strictly need whale oil just to see in the dark, the whole economic house of cards began to collapse.
Section 4. The Technology Paradox in the 19th and 20th Century.
History is absolutely full of incredible nuance, and technology is so often a double-edged sword. Its impact on the whales was incredibly paradoxical, and this brilliantly illustrates exactly what I mean. On the left side, we see technology displacing the need for whale products entirely. Gaslighting, the invention of electricity, vegetable oils, and synthetic materials, they all gradually replace the need for whale oil and bone in consumer goods. But look at the right side. Other technologies actually made whales vastly easier to kill. Steam engines meant a ship could finally outrun a fleeing whale. Mechanized explosive harpoons replaced hand-thrown spears, ensuring an instant kill. Massive factory ships allowed fleets to process the animals entirely at sea without ever returning to port. So wild as it sounds, as we needed whales less, we actually became terrifyingly efficient at hunting the ones that were left. Technology removed the absolute necessity, but it simultaneously amplified the efficiency of the slaughter.
Section 5. From Resource to Rescue, covering the early 18th century to 1986.
As we move into the 20th century, the economic excuse of absolute necessity completely vanishes, and into that vacuum steps something entirely new. The loud industrial roar of the whaling era slowly fades into the quiet, rhythmic ticking of a clock as science, activism, and ultimately the law take over. It started with simple observation. Early marine biologists began documenting severe population collapses, like noting that the Atlantic gray whale had disappeared entirely by the early 18th century. At the same time, activism really began to stir. Now, this cultural shift took decades. It required scientific warnings and eventually things like underwater recordings of whale songs that profoundly changed public perception. People gradually stopped seeing whales as monsters of the deep or just swimming oil barrels, and finally started recognizing them as the intelligent, social, and ecologically vital creatures they are. Let's move to and see how this builds a legal framework, step by methodical step, slowly tightening the net of protection. In 1931, we see the very early international regulations. By 1937, an international agreement brought closed seasons and absolute protection for right and gray whales. Then, the International Whaling Commission, or IWC, was created in 1946. Jumping ahead to the 70s, U.S. legislation really locked down firm boundaries with the Marine Mammal Protection Act of 1972 and the Endangered Species Act of 1973. Finally, the IWC voted for a commercial whaling moratorium in 1982, which took full effect in 1986, literally setting global commercial catch limits to zero.
This entire progression reveals one of the most profound legal transformations of the modern era. Look at this observation. The first international laws were designed to conserve whale populations so an orderly whaling industry could continue. Over time, that logic changed from managing a resource to protecting animals. The first international laws did not begin with the belief that no whale should ever be killed. They were initially designed to conserve populations just so an orderly whaling industry could survive. But over time, that logic flipped completely, from managing a commodity to protecting a living creature. Once the economic necessity was removed by technology and alternative fuels, an activity that was once celebrated as a heroic civic virtue suddenly appeared cold and, well, barbaric.
Ultimately, technology and economics removed the excuse of necessity, which allowed culture, science, and law to actually finish the work of saving the whales. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. If economic alternatives were the true catalyst that saved the whale, what economic alternatives do we urgently need to build today to save our current endangered ecosystems? Just think about that as you look at modern conservation. Thank you so much for exploring this incredible slice of history with me today in this explainer.
Welcome to The Explainer. We spent a lot of time out in the historical ocean, really dissecting the global machinery of the 19th century whaling industry. But today, we're bringing our focus ashore, right into the present day. We're shifting our lens from the wooden decks of old whaling ships to the pastures, the feedlots, and the food labs of 2024 and beyond.
So, here's a profound question to hook us right in, thinking about the 1840s versus 2024. If whale meat had been as cheap, abundant, and culturally central as our modern hamburger, would we still be out there whaling today?
You know, for centuries, society absolutely insisted that killing whales was a non-negotiable requirement for civilization. But humanity didn't just wake up one morning and experience some spontaneous moral awakening. Okay, let's dive into this because a very specific sequence of conditions had to align between the 1800s and 1986. Innovation weakened the economic need for whale oil. Science revealed the damage. Activism changed the politics. Law made protection enforceable. That right there, that is the central thesis of the entire history of whale conservation. The violence only became unthinkable when those four specific elements locked into place.
Section 2. The Modern Parallel. Present day, 2024.
Now, we have to be clear here. The cow is not a whale on land. These systems are different. But the moral structure is similar. An animal's body becomes embedded in food, labor, commerce, habit, and identity. In the 1800s, the whale was viewed as an oil well, a product. And today, in 2024, the cow is often viewed through that exact same commercial lens.
And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer physical scale of our modern system. Looking at the data for 2024, livestock occupies roughly 77% of global agricultural land, while supplying approximately 18% of calories and 37% of protein. That is an absolutely staggering footprint when you think about the resource allocation involved.
Building on that footprint, when looking at 2020's research, beef generally carries a much larger land and greenhouse gas burden than plant-based proteins, although exact figures vary by production method and what the analysis includes. It's a complex picture, but the overall environmental burden is demonstrably heavy.
Section 3. The Technological Escape Hatch, covering 2024 to 2050.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how modern food technology is stepping up, much like kerosene did for whale oil. We're looking at things like advanced plant-based proteins, precision fermentation, and cultivated meat through the 2030s. These technologies create the possibility of reducing the need for animal slaughter. Whether they succeed depends on price, taste, nutrition, availability, regulation, and cultural acceptance. Technology basically just opens the door.
This brings us to a really profound ethical pivot looking into the near future. Technology removes the excuse of necessity. Once an alternative can perform the same function, the question changes from, can humans live without this animal, to, why are we still using it? Once we didn't actually need the whale to survive, we finally had the freedom to see it completely differently.
Section 4. The Grace Test. Looking toward 2050 and beyond.
Just to quickly recap the timeline from 1986 to our future, the whale received grace because a specific combination of forces aligned. We had economic substitution, cultural change, and enforceable law. That was the definitive, undeniable recipe for protection. So, the crucial point is, imagine if the stakes had been slightly different. Looking at our future projections, if whale meat had been as cheap, familiar, and culturally central as a hamburger, would the arrival of kerosene alone have ended whaling? Honestly, probably not. Demand would have continued until law, activism, and a major cultural shift finally intervened. Tech kicks things off, but humanity has to make the choice.
Which leads us right here. If in the future we can make a burger that is affordable, convenient, nutritious, and delicious, completely without killing a cow, what exactly are we preserving by killing one? Are we preserving an absolute necessity, or are we just preserving a habit? I'll leave you with one final knockout question for now and tomorrow. If we stopped whaling the moment we found a better light, what stops us from giving cows the same grace the moment we have a better plate? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. If you want to dive deeper into this whole incredible story, click the link in my bio to watch the full-length version on YouTube. Keep asking those hard questions, and I'll catch you next time.